James Thompson was no stranger to hard work. At 72 years old, his life had been a tapestry of sacrifices and quiet resilience. With hands worn from decades of labor and eyes that carried the weight of countless untold stories, James walked into the hospital one chilly Tuesday afternoon, clutching his chest. The pain had started earlier that morning while he was watering his small garden, a sharp, stabbing sensation that made it hard to breathe. But James wasn't one to complain easily. He thought maybe it was just indigestion or fatigue catching up with him after years of pushing through challenges. A hospital lobby buzzed with activity. Doctors rushing past in white coats, nurses wheeling patients down corridors, and families huddled together in anxious whispers. James approached the reception desk, leaning heavily on his cane as he explained his symptoms to the young woman behind the counter. She nodded politely but didn't seem too concerned. "Have a seat," she said briskly, handing him a clipboard filled with forms. As James sat among strangers waiting for his turn, he couldn't help but notice how some people were attended to faster than others. A well-dressed businessman walked in shortly after him, complaining of mild dizziness. Within minutes, he was whisked away by a nurse. Meanwhile, an elderly woman sitting next to James muttered under her breath about being ignored for over an hour. James offered her a kind smile, though inside he felt uneasy. Finally, his name was called. A doctor, a tall man with a clipboard and a distracted expression, led him into a tiny examination room. James described his symptoms again, this time more urgently. "It feels like something's squeezing my chest," he said, wincing slightly as another wave of pain hit him. The doctor barely looked up from his notes. He murmured, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "Could be stress or acid reflux. Happens all the time." James frowned. "But what if it's something worse? My father died of heart problems when I was young." The doctor shrugged dismissively. "We'll run some basic tests. But honestly, Mr. Thompson, you don't seem like someone who needs urgent care." Those words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they carried an undertone of indifference. It wasn't the first time James had felt invisible, but here, in a place meant to heal, it cut deeper than ever. After a quick blood pressure check and a few routine questions, the doctor scribbled something on a prescription pad and handed it to James. "Take these pills if the pain comes back," he said curtly before turning toward the door. "Otherwise, try to relax. You're probably fine." "Wait," James protested, raising his voice slightly. "Shouldn't we do more testing? What about my heart?" The doctor paused mid-step, glancing back with thinly veiled impatience. "Look, Mr. Thompson, hospitals are busy places. We can't waste resources on every little ache and pain. If you're still worried tomorrow, see your primary care physician." And with that, he left the room. Frustrated and humiliated, James slowly gathered his belongings and shuffled out of the hospital. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just because of the lingering pain in his chest, but because of the sinking realization that he'd been brushed aside once again. As he stepped outside into the cold air, he wondered bitterly whether things would have been different if he looked different, if he were younger, wealthier, or simply not black. For now, all he wanted was to go home and forget about the whole ordeal. But deep down, James knew the pain wasn't going away. And neither was the bitter taste of neglect. James trudged home, each step heavier than the last. The cold wind nipped at his face, but it wasn't nearly as biting as the ache in his chest or the ache in his heart. He clutched the small slip of paper with the prescription scribbled on it, though he hadn't even glanced at it since leaving the hospital. How could a few pills fix what felt like a storm brewing inside him? His breathing grew shallow as he climbed the creaky stairs to his second-floor apartment, every movement feeling like an uphill battle. Once inside, James leaned against the door for support, trying to catch his breath. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight against the fading daylight. It was quiet, too quiet, and that silence pressed down on him like a weight. For years, James had prided himself on handling life's challenges alone. Whether it was working 2 jobs to put food on the table or raising Marcus as a single father after his wife passed away, he'd always found a way to persevere without asking for help. But now, standing there in the middle of his living room, he felt utterly defeated. The pain in his chest intensified, radiating out to his left arm. James winced and sank into his worn recliner, gripping the armrests tightly. He tried to convince himself it was just stress, just exhaustion, just anything other than what it might really be. Yet deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. His mind flashed back to the doctor's dismissive tone, the way he'd been brushed off so carelessly. Was this how it ended? Alone, ignored, and gasping for air in a chair that had seen better days. His thoughts turned to Marcus. His son was the one bright spot in his life, the person who gave meaning to all those years of sacrifice. Marcus had grown into a strong, confident man, someone James admired deeply. They didn't talk often. Their lives were busy, and they lived across town from each other. But whenever they did meet, Marcus always brought laughter and warmth, reminding James of happier times. Summoning what little energy he had left, James reached for the old rotary phone sitting on the side table. His hands trembled as he dialed Marcus's number, each ring echoing like a countdown in his mind. When Marcus finally picked up, his voice was groggy. It must have been late, but instantly alert when he heard his father's strained whisper. "Marcus, I need you," James managed before the words caught in his throat. The phone slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor as darkness began to close in around him. He slumped forward in the chair, his vision blurring, his body betraying him. In that moment, James felt more vulnerable than ever before. All his strength, all his resilience seemed to vanish in an instant. But even as consciousness slipped away, James held on to one thought. Marcus would come. If anyone could make sense of this mess, it was his son. And maybe, just maybe, Marcus could fight for him in ways James never could for himself. As the world faded to black, James hoped desperately that it wasn't too late, that someone would finally listen and give him the care he deserved. Time passed in a haze. James wasn't sure how long he sat there, half-conscious, until he heard the sound of hurried footsteps rushing toward him. It was Marcus, bursting through the door with panic written all over his face. "Dad!" he shouted, kneeling beside the chair and gently shaking James awake. "Stay with me, okay? I'm here." For the first time in hours, James felt a flicker of hope. Maybe being invisible didn't mean being forgotten. Not if you had someone willing to stand up for you. The sound of Marcus's voice cut through the haze like a lifeline. James stirred faintly, his eyelids fluttering open to see his son's worried face hovering above him. Marcus was already on the phone, barking instructions to an emergency operator while keeping one hand firmly pressed against his father's shoulder. "Stay with me, Dad," he repeated, his tone urgent but steady. "Help is coming." James tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His chest felt like it was being crushed under an invisible weight, and every shallow breath burned. He could feel Marcus's grip tightening, as if afraid that letting go would mean losing him altogether. For the first time in hours, James wasn't alone, and just knowing that gave him a sliver of strength. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet night air. Paramedics rushed into the apartment, their movements quick and practiced. They assessed James's condition, attaching monitors and oxygen masks while firing questions at Marcus. "How long has he been like this?" one asked, checking James's vitals. "He called me about 20 minutes ago," Marcus replied, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to stay calm. "He said he had chest pain earlier today, but the hospital turned him away." The paramedic paused briefly, exchanging a glance with his partner before focusing back on James. "We need to get him to the ER immediately," he said firmly. As they loaded James onto a stretcher, Marcus followed close behind, refusing to leave his father's side. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and muffled voices. Marcus sat in a cramped ambulance, holding James's hand tightly. He watched as the medical team worked tirelessly to stabilize his father, their faces etched with concentration. Though Marcus didn't understand all the technical terms they were using, one thing was clear. This wasn't just indigestion or stress. It was serious. When they arrived at the hospital, the same one that had sent James home earlier, Marcus sprang into action. This time, there would be no dismissive glances or hurried diagnosis. He marched up to the front desk, demanding immediate attention for his father. "My dad almost died because you people ignored him earlier," he snapped, his voice rising with frustration. "Don't let that happen again." His outburst drew stares from both staff and patients, but Marcus didn't care. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to save his father's life. The receptionist quickly paged a doctor, and within moments, James was wheeled into the emergency room. Marcus paced outside, his mind racing. How could this have happened? Why hadn't anyone listened? As he waited, anger simmered beneath the surface. But more than anger, there was fear, a deep, gnawing fear that he might lose the man who had raised him, sacrificed everything for him, and taught him what it meant to be strong. Marcus clenched his fists, vowing silently not to let anyone brush them off again. Finally, a nurse emerged from the ER, her expression unreadable. Marcus approached her anxiously. "How is he?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "He's stable for now," she said gently. "But we're running tests to figure out exactly what's going on. You should prepare yourself. It looks serious." Marcus nodded, exhaling sharply. Serious was better than hopeless. Serious meant there was still a chance. Still pacing, he pulled out his phone and began jotting down notes. If the hospital thought they could push them aside again, they were dead wrong. Marcus wasn't just James' son. He was also a fighter. And starting tonight, he would fight tooth and nail to ensure his father got the care he deserved. As Marcus waited for updates, his mind raced with questions. What had happened to his father? Why had the hospital dismissed him so carelessly earlier? The anger simmering inside him began to take shape, sharpening into determination. He wasn't just going to sit back and hope for answers. He was going to demand them. When a doctor finally emerged from the ER, Marcus approached him with a mix of urgency and controlled frustration. "What's going on with my dad?" he asked, his voice firm but measured. The doctor hesitated, glancing at the clipboard in his hands before speaking. "Your father is stable now, but we've discovered some concerning signs. Based on preliminary tests, it appears he suffered a mild heart attack earlier today. We're conducting further evaluations to determine the extent of the damage." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. A heart attack. His father had been sent home with nothing more than a prescription for painkillers, while his body was literally breaking down. How could this have been missed? "I need to see his records," Marcus said abruptly. "Everything. The initial visit, the tests you're running now, everything." The doctor frowned slightly, caught off guard by the request. "Sir, patient records are confidential." "And I'm his son," Marcus interrupted, his tone unyielding. "I have every right to know what happened here. If mistakes were made, I want to understand how and why." Reluctantly, the doctor nodded and led Marcus to a private office. There, Marcus sifted through the paperwork, his sharp legal mind dissecting every detail. It didn't take long for patterns to emerge. James's symptoms had been clear: chest pain radiating to the arm, shortness of breath, fatigue, all classic signs of a potential cardiac event. Yet the notes from the first visit barely acknowledged these red flags. Instead, vague terms like anxiety and non-specific discomfort dominated the page. Marcus clenched his jaw, feeling the surge of rage mixed with disbelief. This wasn't just negligence. It was systemic failure. He pressed the doctor for more information, asking pointed questions about protocols and decision-making processes. Each answer only deepened his suspicion that bias had played a role in how James was treated. Determined to uncover the truth, Marcus sought out other staff members. Nurses, technicians, even janitors. He spoke to anyone who would listen. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. One nurse admitted that elderly black patients often received less attention during triage. Another mentioned how complaints from minority families were sometimes brushed aside as overly dramatic or exaggerated. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern woven into the fabric of the hospital's culture. Armed with this knowledge, Marcus felt a fire ignite within him. His father wasn't just a victim of medical oversight. He was a casualty of systemic inequality. And Marcus knew exactly what to do next. He returned to the waiting area and pulled out his phone, drafting an email to a journalist friend who specialized in healthcare issues. In concise but powerful language, he outlined what had happened to James, attaching copies of the medical records he'd managed to obtain. Then he called the hospital administrator, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss his findings. By the time morning arrived, Marcus had transformed from a worried son into a formidable advocate. As he sat beside James's hospital bed, watching his father sleep peacefully under careful monitoring, he whispered softly, "You're not invisible anymore, Dad. Not to me. And not to anyone else." For the first time since the nightmare began, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. Justice for his father, and for countless others like him, was worth every ounce of effort. Marcus's actions quickly gained momentum, turning what had started as a personal fight for his father into a much larger movement. The journalist he contacted published a detailed article exposing the hospital's discriminatory practices, sparking outrage across the community. Social media lit up with stories from other patients and families who had faced similar neglect. One woman shared how her grandmother's diabetes complications were dismissed as old age. Another man recounted how his brother was sent home with painkillers despite having severe appendicitis. Each story added fuel to the fire Marcus had ignited. The hospital administration scrambled to respond, issuing vague apologies and promises of internal reviews. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with hollow words. He organized a town hall meeting at a local community center, inviting residents, activists, and healthcare professionals to come together and discuss systemic issues in medicine. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, and within days, the small venue was packed with people eager to share their experiences and demand change. At the meeting, Marcus stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding attention. He began by sharing James's story, how his father had been turned away despite clear signs of a heart attack, how bias had nearly cost him his life. His voice trembled with emotion, but remained steady as he spoke. "This isn't just about my dad," he said, looking out at the crowd. "It's about all of us. It's about making sure no one else has to beg for care because of the color of their skin or the number on their paycheck." The audience erupted in applause, many nodding in agreement. People lined up to speak, sharing their own frustrations and fears about navigating a healthcare system that often felt stacked against them. A nurse in the crowd bravely admitted that she'd witnessed racial bias firsthand during her years at the hospital, describing how certain patients were labeled difficult simply because they asked too many questions. Her honesty brought murmurs of support from others who had seen the same patterns play out. Encouraged by the turnout, Marcus decided to take things further. He partnered with local advocacy groups to draft a formal complaint against the hospital, demanding accountability and transparency. The document outlined specific cases of neglect, including James's, and called for policy changes to address racial disparities in patient care. When the complaint was filed, it caught the attention of national news outlets, amplifying the issue beyond the confines of their small city. As public pressure mounted, the hospital was forced to act. They announced plans to implement mandatory bias training for staff and establish a committee to review patient complaints more thoroughly. While Marcus acknowledged these steps as progress, he made it clear that real change would require ongoing vigilance. "We can't let this become another empty promise," he told reporters during an interview. "Our voices matter, and we won't stop speaking until everyone gets the care they deserve." Meanwhile, Marcus continued advocating not just locally but nationally. He joined panels discussing healthcare equity, wrote op-eds for major newspapers, and even testified before state lawmakers about the need for reform. His efforts inspired others to step forward, creating a ripple effect that reached far beyond what he could have imagined. Through it all, Marcus never lost sight of why he started this journey. His father. Every speech, every meeting, every late-night planning session was fueled by the memory of James sitting alone in that hospital waiting room, feeling invisible. And though the road ahead was long, Marcus knew they were moving in the right direction, one step closer to a world where no one would ever have to endure what James did. By standing up for his father, Marcus had become a beacon of hope for countless others. Together, they were proving that when people unite to demand justice, even the most entrenched systems can begin to shift. As the weeks passed, James's health began to improve under careful medical supervision. The doctors at the hospital, now keenly aware of the scrutiny surrounding their practices, ensured he received top-tier care. Marcus visited every day, bringing books, warm meals, and updates on his advocacy work. Though James was grateful for the attention, he couldn't shake the heaviness that lingered in his heart, not from the physical pain, but from the emotional toll of feeling dismissed and unseen. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the hospital window, Marcus pulled up a chair beside his father's bed. "How are you holding up, Dad?" he asked gently, studying James's face for any sign of discomfort. James sighed, leaning back against the pillows. "I'm getting better, son," he said softly. "But it's hard not to think about everything that happened. I've spent my whole life working hard, trying to do right by people, and yet sometimes it feels like none of that matters." Marcus reached out and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "It does matter, Dad. You've always been strong. For me, for our family. But you don't have to carry this weight alone anymore. That's what I'm here for." Tears welled up in James's eyes, though he quickly blinked them away. "You've done so much already, Marcus. More than I ever expected. But I worry. What if things don't change? What if all your hard work doesn't make a difference?" Marcus smiled, though there was a flicker of sadness in his expression. "Change takes time, Dad. It won't happen overnight. But look around you. People are listening. They're talking about this. Even if we only help one person avoid what you went through, isn't that worth it?" James nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Cars honking, children laughing, leaves rustling in the breeze. It was a reminder that the world kept moving, even when it felt like everything had stopped for him. And in that moment, he realized something important. While he couldn't control how others treated him, he could choose how he responded. He could let bitterness consume him, or he could use this experience to grow stronger, together with his son. Over the next few weeks, father and son grew closer than they had been in years. They talked about everything. The struggles James faced as a young man raising Marcus alone, the sacrifices he made to provide for his family, and the quiet moments of joy that had kept him going. For Marcus, these conversations were eye-opening. He'd always admired his father's resilience, but hearing the stories behind it gave him a deeper appreciation for the man James truly was. When James was finally discharged from the hospital, Marcus insisted on staying with him for a while to help with recovery. Together, they settled into a routine. Morning walks around the neighborhood, afternoons spent watching old movies, and evenings cooking dinner side by side. It was simple, peaceful, and exactly what both of them needed after such a turbulent time. Still, Marcus didn't lose sight of the bigger picture. He continued attending meetings, speaking at events, and pushing for policy changes in healthcare. James, inspired by his son's determination, decided to join him in his own way. Using his years of wisdom and kindness, he started mentoring young people in the community, sharing stories of resilience, and teaching them the value of standing up for themselves. "You've taught me so much, Dad," Marcus said one evening as they sat on the porch, sipping tea, "about strength, patience, and never giving up." Now it's my turn to teach others what I've learned from you." James chuckled, shaking his head. "Seems like we're quite the team, huh?" "The best," Marcus replied with a grin. "And we're just getting started." Though scars remained, both visible and invisible, they served as reminders of how far they'd come. Through love, perseverance, and an unshakable bond, James and Marcus proved that healing wasn't just about mending broken bodies. It was about rebuilding trust, finding purpose, and creating a legacy of hope for generations to come. Months turned into a year, and the ripple effects of Marcus's fight for justice continued to spread far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. The hospital, once resistant to change, began implementing reforms that went beyond mere lip service. Bias training became mandatory not just for doctors, but for every staff member, from receptionists to janitors. A new patient advocacy office was established, staffed by individuals dedicated to addressing complaints and ensuring equitable treatment for all. Slowly but surely, the culture within the institution started to shift. Outside the hospital walls, Marcus's efforts inspired a wave of activism across the city. Community leaders formed coalitions focused on healthcare equity, hosting workshops, fundraisers, and awareness campaigns. Local schools invited Marcus to speak to students about systemic inequality and the importance of standing up for marginalized voices. His story resonated deeply with young people, many of whom promised to carry the torch forward in their own careers and communities. For James, life took on a renewed sense of purpose. Though his recovery had been slow, he embraced each day with gratitude and determination. Mentoring young people became his passion project, and he often shared his experience at community events, urging others to speak up when they felt unseen or unheard. "You don't have to accept being invisible," he'd say, his voice steady and warm. "There's power in your voice, and there are people ready to listen." The bond between father and son grew even stronger during this time. They worked side by side, attending meetings, organizing events, and supporting one another through the highs and lows of their shared mission. On weekends, they'd return to simpler pleasures, gardening, cooking, and reminiscing about old memories. These quiet moments were a reminder that while the world outside demanded their energy and attention, home remained their sanctuary. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Marcus turned to his father with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever wonder if we're making enough of a difference?" he asked. "Sometimes it feels like no matter how hard we try, the problems are still so big." James smiled, placing a weathered hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Son, change doesn't happen overnight. But look at where we've come from. Look at the lives we've touched, even in small ways. That's what matters. Every step counts, no matter how small." Marcus nodded, feeling a renewed sense of resolve. He realized that the journey wasn't about achieving perfection. It was about planting seeds of hope and watching them grow over time. And those seeds were already sprouting, in the policies being rewritten, in the stories of patients receiving fair treatment, and in the hearts of young people inspired to create a better future. As the years passed, James eventually slowed down, content to spend more time tending to his garden and mentoring neighborhood kids. Marcus, however, continued his work on a larger scale, becoming a national advocate for healthcare reform. He traveled across the country, speaking at conferences, meeting with lawmakers, and collaborating with other activists to push for systemic change. Yet no matter where his journey took him, he always came back to his roots, to the lessons he'd learned from his father, and the love that had fueled his fight. Their legacy lived on in countless ways. The hospital where James had nearly lost his life became a model for other institutions striving to eliminate bias in patient care. Young mentees James had guided went on to pursue careers in medicine, law, and education, determined to make a difference. And Marcus's advocacy inspired a new generation of leaders unafraid to challenge injustice wherever they found it. In the end, what started as a personal tragedy transformed into a story of triumph, not just for James and Marcus, but for everyone who benefited from their courage and resilience. Through love, determination, and an unwavering commitment to justice, they proved that even the smallest acts of resistance could spark monumental change. Theirs was a legacy of hope, a testament to the power of standing together against adversity and leaving the world a little brighter than they found it.